April 11, 1945. A lone Japanese kamikaze pilot skimmed just above the waves of the Pacific Ocean, his aircraft loaded with explosives, eyes fixed on the silhouette of an American destroyer 90 miles east of Okinawa. On the deck of the USS KIDD, 20-year-old gunner Maurice Clements stood helpless at his battle station, unable to fire his weapons without risking hitting another American vessel nearby. The world around him moved in slow motion as the suicide plane cleared one ship, pulled upward, then turned directly toward the KIDD. The sickening crunch of metal against metal echoed across the water as the aircraft plowed into the starboard side, penetrating the forward boiler room in a blinding flash of fire and steam. Black smoke billowed from the wound in the destroyer's hull, signaling what should have been its final moments. But the USS KIDD would not sink that day. Despite losing 38 men with another 55 wounded, nearly one-third of her crew, the ship somehow survived, limping away to fight another day. This resilience earned her a fearsome nickname among the Japanese who had witnessed American destroyers return from seemingly fatal blows, the ghost ship. No one in the Imperial Japanese Navy knew that the bold innovations and split-second decisions made by ordinary sailors aboard this vessel would repeatedly snatch victory from the jaws of certain defeat, creating a legend that would outlive the war itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the decks of the USS KIDD as she cut through the calm waters of the Pacific. For the men who called this Fletcher-class destroyer home, the dawn of April 11th seemed deceptively peaceful. The sky was clear, the sea gentle, what sailors called good fighting weather. Few could have guessed that before the sunset, their ship would be fighting for its very survival, and their actions would cement its reputation as the vessel that refused to die. Harold Monning never intended to join the Navy. Growing up during the Great Depression in Amarillo, Texas, his childhood had been defined by dust storms and economic hardship. The middle son of 5 children, he had watched his parents struggle to put food on the table as the family farm withered in the unrelenting drought. His father, a railroad worker who took any shift he could get, had instilled in him a quiet resilience and mechanical aptitude that would serve him well in the years to come. Every Sunday, the Monning family would gather around their radio to listen to news of faraway events: Hitler's rise in Germany, Japanese expansion in China, the growing tensions in Europe. These distant conflicts seemed removed from the immediate challenges of survival in rural Texas. Harold had been planning to follow his father into the railroad business when Pearl Harbor changed everything. The image of Battleship Row in flames and stories of sailors trapped below decks haunted the 18-year-old. By January of 1942, he had enlisted in the Navy, determined to play his part in what had become a global fight for survival. "My mother cried when I told her," he would later recall in letters home, "but my father just shook my hand and said, 'Make it count.' Those words stayed with me through every battle, every close call. Whatever I did out there had to count for something." After boot camp in San Diego, where the farm boy from Texas got his first glimpse of the ocean, Monning's mechanical skills earned him assignment to the USS KIDD, a Fletcher-class destroyer under construction at Federal Shipbuilding in Kearney, New Jersey. The vessel was named after Rear Admiral Isaac Campbell Kidd, who had been killed on the bridge of the USS Arizona during the Pearl Harbor attack, the first American flag officer to die in World War II. For young sailors like Monning, the ship's namesake was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. When the KIDD was commissioned on April 23, 1943, Monning was among her original crew members assigned to damage control and engineering, skills that would become crucial in the desperate days to come. The commissioning ceremony was attended by Admiral Kidd's widow, who christened the ship and presented the crew with a handsome guest book inscribed with the words, "May the destiny of the USS KIDD be glorious. May her victories be triumphant and conclusive." None could have predicted just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The Fletcher-class destroyers represented the backbone of the American naval war effort, fast, agile vessels armed with 5-inch guns, torpedo tubes, and anti-aircraft weapons. At 376 feet in length, displacing 2,050 tons, with a complement of roughly 300 men, these ships were designed to escort larger vessels, screen amphibious landings, and hunt submarines. With a top speed of 35 knots, they could outrun most threats, while their armament allowed them to engage everything from submarines to aircraft. Below the waterline, they contained complex machinery that transformed them into floating cities. Boilers that generated steam to drive the turbines, electrical systems, freshwater distillation units, and the complicated networks of pipes, valves, and cables that kept everything functioning. For men like Manning, mastering this labyrinth of technology was both a professional challenge and a matter of survival. Every sailor aboard understood that their lives depended on the proper functioning of these systems, particularly when combat damage threatened the ship's integrity. But nothing in their design specifications prepared them for the kamikaze onslaught they would eventually face. Manning and his shipmates could not have known that their vessel would soon become one of the most recognized and feared in the Pacific theater. Nor could they have anticipated that their innovative approaches to damage control would save not only their ship, but countless American lives throughout the fleet. The KIDD's journey into legend began with an unconventional choice that raised eyebrows throughout the Navy. During her initial cruise from the shipyard to the Brooklyn Naval Shipyards, Commander Alan Roby ordered something unprecedented: the hoisting of the Jolly Roger skull and crossbones from the foremast. Time magazine would later report that it had been 100 years since the pirate flag had flown in New York Harbor. Not stopping there, the crew hired a local cartoonist to paint a caricature of the notorious pirate Captain Kidd on the forward smokestack. Some officers from other vessels questioned this breach of naval tradition. Was it not disrespectful to adorn a warship named after a fallen American hero with pirate imagery? The ship's widow, Mrs. Isaac Kidd, settled the matter by giving her blessing to this unusual tribute, understanding that sailors often adopted mascots to build camaraderie. She recognized that her husband, who had been known at the Naval Academy by the nickname Cap Kidd, would have appreciated the spirit behind the gesture. Little did anyone realize that this distinctive marking would later make the ship instantly recognizable to both allies and enemies across the Pacific, and contribute to its ghostly reputation. Japanese reconnaissance pilots would use the pirate emblem to identify the Kidd in their reports, making it easier for them to track the destroyer's movements. This visibility would later contribute to the confusion when the seemingly destroyed vessel reappeared in battle formations, fueling rumors of a supernatural presence among superstitious enemy forces. In August of 1943, the Kidd transited the Panama Canal alongside 3 other destroyers, escorting the battleships USS Alabama and South Dakota toward Pearl Harbor. The journey through the canal was a marvel of engineering that left many of the farm boys and city kids in the crew awestruck. Rising and falling through the massive locks, watching the landscape transform from the Atlantic to the Pacific side provided a momentary distraction from the looming reality of combat. For Manning and many of his shipmates, the arrival at Pearl Harbor delivered their first glimpse of the devastation there, with the wreckage of battleships still visible, a sobering reminder of why they were sailing toward war. The blackened hulls and protruding superstructures of sunken vessels were stark monuments to the attack that had thrust America into global conflict. Many men stood silently at the rails as they passed the site where Admiral Kidd had lost his life, their ship now carrying both his name and the responsibility of avenging the Pearl Harbor attack. The crew of the Kidd faced their first taste of danger during a training exercise in September when 2 star shells from the battleship USS North Carolina struck the destroyer during a simulated torpedo attack. Fate seemed to smile on them. A sailor already strapped into a stretcher for the exercise drill received only minor wounds from debris. Commander Robbie Riley reported to his superiors, "Kidd claims to be the best prepared ship in the Navy. We had a victim already strapped in the stretcher when he was wounded. This blend of professionalism and dark humor defined the KIDD's crew culture as they prepared for combat. The men knew they were sailing into harm's way, but few could have predicted the legendary status their ship would achieve. As 1943 drew to a close, the KIDD would find herself at the center of some of the Pacific War's most crucial campaigns, from Wake Island to Rabaul, from Tarawa to the Gilbert Islands. With each engagement, the reputation of the Pirate of the Pacific grew, both among Allied forces and Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American naval movements. Lieutenant James Burdick recalled the moment that first earned the KIDD its supernatural reputation. "We were escorting carriers near Rabaul in November 1943 when a pilot from the USS Essex ditched near our position. Captain Roby immediately ordered us to break formation to attempt rescue, even though it meant exposing ourselves to enemy aircraft. As we reached the downed airmen, a wave of Japanese bombers spotted us isolated from the main fleet." What happened next would become part of naval legend. Alone and vulnerable, the KIDD found herself under attack by more than a dozen Japanese aircraft. Rather than abandoning the rescue to seek the protection of the main fleet, Captain Roby ordered all guns to engage while continuing the recovery operation. The ship executed evasive maneuvers, dodging bombs and torpedoes, while still managing to pluck the downed aviators from the sea. In a display of extraordinary shooting, the KIDD's gunners downed 3 enemy planes during the rescue. Captain Roby would later receive the Silver Star for his actions that day, but something else happened, something that would eventually reach the ears of Japanese naval intelligence. A captured Japanese pilot would later reveal that radio chatter from the attacking planes had reported hitting the isolated American destroyer multiple times, yet somehow the vessel had continued fighting, continued rescuing, continued sailing. The first whispers of ghost ship began circulating among Japanese aviators who could not understand how a vessel reportedly struck by bombs could remain operational. This pattern would repeat itself throughout the war, the KIDD appearing where least expected, surviving damage that should have sunk her, and returning to battle with her distinctive pirate emblem still visible on her stack. The Japanese Navy, steeped in tradition and superstition, began to view the KIDD with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. The KIDD's reputation was further enhanced by an unusual practice that began after the rescue of the Essex pilots. Upon returning to the carrier, Captain Roby jokingly demanded ransom for the returned aviators, specifically ice cream for his crew. The carrier's captain, amused by the request, complied, sending over several gallons of the rare treat. This began a tradition. Whenever the KIDD rescued downed pilots, her crew expected ice cream as payment. Word of the pirate ship that ransomed airmen for ice cream spread throughout the fleet, adding a colorful dimension to the vessel's growing mythology. For the Japanese who monitored American radio transmissions and interrogated prisoners of war, these stories contributed to the image of an unusual vessel that didn't follow normal rules of engagement or conduct. Intelligence reports began to track the ship specifically, noting its distinctive appearance and aggressive tactics. This attention would prove significant later when reports of the KIDD's destruction reached Tokyo, only to be contradicted by subsequent sightings. By early 1944, the strategic momentum in the Pacific had shifted. The Americans were on the offensive, and the KIDD was in the vanguard of this massive naval juggernaut. For Harold Monning and his shipmates, the pace of combat was relentless. On January 11, 1944, they departed for the Marshall Islands invasion, participating in the bombardment of Roy and Wotje. By March, they were supporting the landings at Emerau, followed by operations at Itape and Hollandia in New Guinea. June brought them to the Marianas Campaign, including the fierce fighting at Guam. Seaman First Class David Rosenberg, a loader for one of the 5-inch gun mounts, described the tension of those days. You'd go weeks with nothing happening, just watching the ocean roll by, then suddenly all hell would break loose. General quarters would sound, and you'd be running to your station while your heart tried to pound its way out of your chest. The fear never really went away, but you learned to function despite it. And there was something about the KIDD that made you feel safer, like she was looking out for us as much as we were looking out for her. This sense of reciprocal protection, of the men safeguarding their ship while the vessel sheltered them, created a powerful bond between the crew and their vessel. They began to anthropomorphize the KIDD, referring to her as she, not just as maritime tradition dictated, but with genuine affection. They celebrated her victories, mourned her wounds, and took pride in her growing reputation. This emotional connection would prove vital in the critical moments to come when personal sacrifice became necessary for collective survival. During these operations, the KIDD developed tactics that went beyond standard Navy protocol, innovations born of necessity and the quick thinking of her crew. Radio Man Second Class. Thomas Weller described one such instance. We were supposed to maintain strict radio silence during night operations, but Lieutenant Grieshaber in engineering developed a system of communicating with other ships using carefully directed signal lamps positioned low to the water where Japanese observers couldn't spot them. It wasn't in any manual, but it allowed our destroyer squadron to coordinate torpedo attacks without giving away our position. After we sank 2 Japanese transports using this method, other destroyer commanders started copying our techniques. These improvisations extended to the ship's damage control procedures as well. Harold Monning had developed a method of patching hull breaches using mattress springs overlaid with canvas and sealed with a mixture of epoxy and coffee grounds, materials readily available aboard ship. When conventional repair materials ran low during extended deployments, Monning's unorthodox technique allowed the KIDD to remain operational rather than withdrawing for repairs. Such innovations contributed to the ship's reputation for being unsinkable, a destroyer that could take punishment and somehow remain in the fight. The ship's gunnery teams also developed non-standard practices that improved their effectiveness in combat. Rather than adhering strictly to the prescribed fire control procedures, they created a more fluid system that allowed individual gun captains greater autonomy in selecting targets during air attacks. This flexibility enabled them to engage more enemy aircraft simultaneously, increasing their defensive capability. While purists might have criticized these deviations from doctrine, the results spoke for themselves. The KIDD consistently recorded higher hit percentages than many of her sister ships. As 1944 progressed, the KIDD continued to participate in the island-hopping campaign that brought American forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands. In October, she joined the massive naval assemblage supporting the liberation of the Philippines, including the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. During these operations, the ship's crew witnessed the introduction of a new and terrifying Japanese tactic: deliberate suicide attacks by aircraft against Allied vessels. Chief Petty Officer William Brockey remembered the first time they encountered what would later be called kamikazes. We'd gotten used to Japanese pilots who'd dive at you, release their bombs, and then pull up. Aggressive but normal tactics. Then suddenly we started seeing planes that just kept coming. No attempt to pull out of the dive, straight into our ships. It changed everything. You couldn't just damage these planes or scare them off. You had to completely destroy them before they reached you. And there were so many of them. The introduction of organized kamikaze attacks transformed naval warfare in the Pacific. For destroyers like the KIDD, the danger increased exponentially. Their relatively light armor made them especially vulnerable to the devastating impact of aircraft loaded with explosives deliberately crashing into their hulls. Yet, paradoxically, their agility and heavy anti-aircraft armament also made them essential for fleet defense. This contradiction would lead to the creation of radar picket stations, positions where destroyers would be placed miles from the main fleet to provide early warning of approaching enemy aircraft. It was a vital but extraordinarily dangerous assignment that would claim many American destroyers in the coming months. By 1945, the war had entered its final desperate phase. American forces were approaching the Japanese home islands, but the closer they came, the more fanatical the resistance grew. The kamikaze attacks intensified, with thousands of Japanese pilots prepared to sacrifice themselves in a last-ditch effort to stave off defeat. For destroyers like the KIDD, placed on picket duty to provide early warning for the main fleet, the danger had never been greater. These small vessels, positioned miles from the protection of the fleet, became the primary targets for waves of suicide aircraft. The odds of survival diminished with each passing day, but the KIDD had already cheated death so many times that her crew maintained a grim confidence. On February 19, 1945, the KIDD sailed to join Task Force 58 for the invasion of Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War and the final stepping stone to Japan itself. The strategic importance of the operation was clear to every sailor aboard. Success at Okinawa would position American forces for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands. Failure would prolong the war indefinitely, at a cost of countless additional lives. In the weeks that followed, she performed multiple roles: screening battleships, bombarding shore targets, rescuing downed pilots, clearing mines, providing radar picket duty, and defending against air attacks. For the men aboard, the pace was grueling. 4-hour watches stretched into 6 or 8 as the Japanese air attacks intensified. Sleep came in brief snatches between general quarters alarms, and hot meals became a distant memory. Yet through it all, the KIDD continued to fight with the aggressive spirit embodied by her pirate emblem. On March 19th, the carrier USS Franklin was devastated by a Japanese bombing attack that ignited her ammunition and aviation fuel, causing explosions that claimed 724 lives. The KIDD was among the destroyers that stood guard over the crippled carrier as her crew fought desperately to save their ship. Throughout the day, Japanese aircraft continued to press the attack, hoping to finish off the vulnerable carrier. The KIDD's gunners maintained a protective barrage that drove off several enemy planes, while her damage control teams assisted with firefighting efforts aboard the larger vessel. This action demonstrated not only the KIDD's fighting spirit, but the versatility of her crew in responding to crises. As the Okinawa campaign intensified, so did the kamikaze threat. Japanese air attacks came in waves, with hundreds of aircraft committed to single strikes against the American fleet. The destroyers on radar picket duty bore the brunt of these assaults, standing their ground to protect the vulnerable transports and carriers further south. The toll was staggering. By the end of the campaign, the U.S. Navy would lose more ships at Okinawa than in any other battle in its history. Destroyers, with their exposed positions and lighter armor, accounted for the majority of these losses. On April 11, 1945, that fighting spirit would be tested as never before. The KIDD was stationed on radar picket duty alongside her sister ships USS Black, USS Bullard, and USS Chauncey, forming a protective screen 90 miles east of Okinawa. Their mission was simple but deadly: serve as an early warning system for the main fleet, drawing enemy attacks away from the vulnerable transports and carriers, essentially offering themselves as bait. The morning had already seen 3 waves of Japanese aircraft repelled by the combined firepower of the destroyers and combat air patrol fighters, but the afternoon would bring a 4th attack, and with it, disaster. The day dawned clear and calm, with visibility extending to the horizon, perfect conditions for both defending against and conducting air attacks. The KIDD's radar operators maintained constant vigilance, their screens sweeping the airspace around the picket station for any sign of approaching aircraft. Throughout the morning, they detected and reported several formations of Japanese planes, vectoring combat air patrol fighters to intercept them before they could threaten the ships below. Maurice Clements was at his battle station as gun captain for the rearmost 5-inch mount when the radar operators first spotted the approaching aircraft. Most of the men in his gun crew were fellow Louisianans, sharing a bond of regional kinship that transcended Navy discipline. At 20 years old, Clements had already seen more combat than most men 3 times his age, But nothing prepared him for what happened next. A group of Japanese aircraft approached low over the water, seemingly engaged in a dogfight with American fighters. Suddenly, one plane broke away from the melee, descending to wave-top height and making directly for the USS Black, positioned 1,600 yards off the KIDD's starboard beam. The Black opened fire with every available weapon, filling the sky with tracers and flak. At the last possible moment, the Japanese pilot pulled up, skimming just over the Black's superstructure. Clements watched in horror as the aircraft banked sharply and headed directly for the KIDD. Because of the angle of approach, with the Black positioned between his gun and the incoming aircraft, Clements could not fire without risking hitting the other American vessel. The KIDD's smaller 20mm and 40mm guns engaged the target, but the kamikaze was moving too fast, too low. "I've never felt so helpless," Clements would later recall. "My gun could have torn that plane apart, but I couldn't risk hitting the Black. All I could do was watch it come in, knowing what was about to happen, unable to do a damn thing about it." Dr. Bruox Garrett, the ship's physician, had been filming the approaching aircraft, not realizing through his viewfinder how close the danger had come until it was too late. Like everyone else on the main deck, he scrambled for cover as the plane struck the KIDD's starboard side, just below the main deck between the boilers in the forward fire room. The boilers ruptured instantly, releasing steam heated to nearly 800 degrees. Every man in that compartment died immediately. The aircraft's bomb was catapulted through the ship by the impact, exiting through the portside hull before exploding just outside the vessel. The blast tore through the KIDD's midsection, shredding metal, destroying equipment, and killing or wounding dozens of sailors. Shrapnel scythed through compartments, rupturing steam lines and severing electrical cables. The forward 40mm gun crews were decimated, while fragments penetrated the Combat Information Center, Radio Central, and the bridge. Secondary explosions erupted as oxygen and acetylene bottles stored for damage control purposes ignited. Within seconds, the orderly routine of the ship dissolved into chaos, smoke, and pain. Harold Monning was below decks when the kamikaze hit, the concussion throwing him against a bulkhead. Through the chaos of alarms and screams, his damage control training took over. The forward boiler room was gone, a twisted mass of metal and steam, but the aft boiler room remained operational. If they could isolate the damaged section and redistribute the load, they might keep the ship moving. Moving methodically despite the crisis unfolding around him, Monning organized teams to combat fires, shore up weakened bulkheads, and tend to the wounded. The destroyer was listing to port, black smoke pouring from her wounded side, but she wasn't dead yet. On the bridge, Captain Harry G. Moore had been severely wounded by shrapnel from the explosion. The executive officer, Lieutenant Burdick Britton, took command long enough to get the ship underway, retreating southward before his own injuries forced him to relinquish control. The ship's chief engineer, Lieutenant George Grieshaber, had been killed in the forward fire room where the plane struck. With the command structure decimated and damage control parties desperately fighting to keep the vessel afloat, the KIDD seemed destined to join the growing list of destroyers lost to kamikaze attacks off Okinawa. But something remarkable happened in those critical minutes. Without orders, sailors across the ship fell back on their training and the innovative procedures they had developed over 2 years of combat operations. Damage control parties adapted Monning's unorthodox repair techniques to seal off flooded compartments. Engineering teams rerouted power from the remaining operational boiler. Gunners maintained a protective fire that drove off several Japanese aircraft attempting to finish the crippled destroyer. Through individual initiative and collective determination, the crew refused to let their ship die. Machinist's mate second class Robert Johnston described the scene in the aft engine room. The lights went out after the hit, and emergency power was slow to come on. We were working by flashlight, trying to maintain steam pressure while listening to the hull groan around us. Every few minutes, another damage report would come down. This compartment flooded, these men missing, fire on the second deck. But no one panicked. We all just kept doing our jobs, keeping the engines running, because we knew if we lost propulsion, we were finished. This calm in the face of catastrophe reflected both the training the men had received and the unique culture that had developed aboard the KIDD. Years of combat had taught them to function effectively under the most extreme conditions, while the ship's reputation for survival gave them confidence that this crisis, too, could be overcome. Unlike crews on vessels with less combat experience, the KDD's sailors had weathered enough storms, both literal and metaphorical, to believe in their collective ability to endure. The cost was horrific. 38 men lost their lives in the attack, their bodies laid out on the fantail, covered with American flags. 55 others suffered wounds ranging from minor burns to life-threatening injuries. Among the dead was Lieutenant George Grieshaber, the innovative engineer whose unofficial modifications to the ship's systems had contributed so much to her fighting reputation. His loss was felt deeply throughout the crew, but in a cruel irony, it was some of his unauthorized adaptations to the ship's damage control systems that now helped keep her afloat. The wounded destroyer managed to rejoin her task group, her guns still firing at enemy aircraft even as damage control teams fought to contain flooding below. As darkness fell, her commanding officers made the difficult decision to withdraw from the combat zone. The KIDD would make for the fleet anchorage at Ulithi Atoll for emergency repairs, burying her dead at sea during the journey. The following day, the surviving crew received another blow. President Franklin Roosevelt had died. For many sailors, it felt as if the pillars of their world were collapsing around them. Yet, even in retreat, the KIDD contributed to her ghostly reputation. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft tracked the destroyer as she limped away from Okinawa, trailing oil and smoke. According to post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers, reports of the KIDD's condition led them to classify her as certainly sunk. When American carriers launched strikes against Japanese positions weeks later, reconnaissance photographs showed what appeared to be the same destroyer, identified by the distinctive pirate emblem on her stack, operating with another task force. Unable to reconcile these sightings with their intelligence reports, some Japanese officers began referring to her as Yurei-kan, ghost ship. The burial at sea of the KIDD's fallen crew members was conducted with solemn dignity despite the continuing danger of enemy attack. The bodies, sewn into canvas shrouds weighted with ammunition, were committed to the deep with full military honors. Captain Moore, though severely wounded, insisted on being brought to the deck on a stretcher to pay his respects to the men who had died under his command. The ceremony was necessarily brief. The threat of further air attacks remained constant, but its impact on the surviving crew was profound. For many, it reinforced their determination to ensure that their shipmates' sacrifices would not be in vain. After receiving temporary repairs at Ulithi, the KIDD departed on May 2nd for the west coast of the United States, arriving at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard near San Francisco on May 25th. The extensive damage required months of repairs, and by the time the ship was ready to return to combat, the war had ended. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945 had forced Japan's surrender, bringing the long Pacific conflict to a close. The KIDD had fired her last shot in anger, but her legend lived on. As shipyard workers swarmed over the damaged destroyer, assessing and repairing the extensive damage, the crew was gradually dispersed to other assignments or sent home on leave. Many would never return to the KIDD, their wartime service complete. For those who remained, overseeing the repairs and maintaining the essential systems, the transition from active combat to peacetime operations was jarring. The constant tension of war gave way to a strange emptiness, a void that many found difficult to fill. Harold Monning was among those who stayed with the ship during her reconstruction. His expertise in damage control made him valuable during the repair process, helping shipyard workers understand the jury-rigged systems that had kept the vessel afloat after the kamikaze strike. As he watched the KIDD gradually return to her pre-attack condition, Monning reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from the Dust Bowl of Texas to this moment. He had entered the war as a teenager and would leave it as a man, forever changed by the experiences he had shared with his shipmates. For the men who had served aboard her, the ship's survival against overwhelming odds seemed nothing short of miraculous. Of the 19 destroyers damaged or sunk during the Okinawa campaign, the most ship losses the U.S. Navy experienced in any single battle, the KIDD was among the fortunate few that survived. Her reputation as the ghost ship that could not be killed had been earned through blood, innovation, and the extraordinary courage of ordinary sailors. The Japanese pilots who had reported her sinking were not mistaken about the severity of the damage they had inflicted. By all normal standards, the KIDD should not have survived the April 11th attack. The kamikaze had struck her in one of the most vulnerable locations possible, devastating her propulsion systems and igniting fires that threatened to reach her magazines. That she remained afloat and operational was a testament both to her construction and to the determination of her crew. The Fletcher-class destroyers had proven their durability throughout the war, but the KIDD had demonstrated a resilience that exceeded even their robust design parameters. In the immediate post-war period, the KIDD was decommissioned on December 10, 1946, joining hundreds of other warships in the Pacific Reserve Fleet. For 5 years, she sat silent and empty, a floating monument to a conflict that had reshaped the world. But as with many aspects of the KIDD's story, fate had other plans. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Navy found itself in urgent need of combat-experienced vessels. On March 28, 1951, the USS KIDD was recommissioned, beginning her second life. The recommissioning ceremony was attended by several of her former crew members, including Harold Monning, who had returned to civilian life but maintained close ties with his naval comrades. For these veterans, seeing their old ship return to active duty brought mixed emotions. Pride that the KIDD would sail again, but concern for the new generation of sailors who would man her during another conflict. They understood, as few others could, both the capabilities and the vulnerabilities of the aging destroyer. During the Korean conflict, the KIDD completed 2 combat deployments, earning 4 additional battle stars to add to the 8 she had received during World War II. Though she'd never faced the same level of danger as she had off Okinawa, her crew maintained the traditions and innovations that had defined her earlier service. The pirate emblem remained proudly displayed on her stack, and stories of her ghost ship status circulated among new crew members, many of whom had been children during World War II. Lieutenant Commander Robert Jeffrey, who commanded the KIDD during her Korean service, made a point of preserving the unique culture that had developed aboard the destroyer. He encouraged veteran sailors to share their experiences with newer crew members, ensuring that the lessons learned during World War II were not forgotten. This institutional memory proved valuable during combat operations off the Korean coast, where the KIDD continued to demonstrate the effectiveness that had made her legendary in the Pacific. Following her Korean War service, the KIDD alternated deployments to the Western Pacific with operations closer to home. In 1957, she even participated in the filming of the motion picture Run Silent, Run Deep, starring Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster, a rare moment of Hollywood glamour for the battle-tested destroyer. By the 1960s, however, the aging vessel was showing her years. Newer, more advanced vessels were entering the fleet, and the Navy was phasing out World War II-era ships. On June 19, 1964, the USS KIDD was decommissioned for the second time, entering the Atlantic Reserve Fleet at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. For many, this seemed to be the final chapter in her remarkable story. The ghost ship would finally rest, but ghosts have a way of reappearing when least expected. In the 1970s, as the Navy prepared to dispose of obsolete vessels, a movement arose to preserve significant warships as floating museums. The Navy designated 3 Fletcher-class destroyers for this purpose: USS the Sullivans, USS Cassinyoung, and USS KIDD. When Congressman William Henson Moore and the citizens of Louisiana sought a suitable vessel to serve as a memorial for the state's veterans, the KIDD was selected, in part because she had escaped the modernization and cannibalization common to ships in the reserve fleet. She remained remarkably similar to her appearance in August 1945, preserving a tangible link to the past. Harold Monning, who had served aboard the KIDD during the World War II, played a crucial role in these preservation efforts. Now in his 50s, with children and grandchildren of his own, Monning had never forgotten the lessons learned aboard the ghost ship. Working with the Desron 48 Reunion Association, a group of veterans who had served in the KIDD's destroyer squadron, he advocated tirelessly for the ship's preservation. Their efforts succeeded, and on May 23, 1982, the USS KIDD arrived at her final berth in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, greeted by a crowd of more than 10,000 people. Among those waiting on the shore that day was Maurice Clements, the gun captain who had watched helplessly as the kamikaze struck nearly 4 decades earlier. Now a carpenter by trade, Clements would contribute his skills to building the unique cradle system that allows the KIDD to rest above the water when the Mississippi River is low. For veterans like Monning and Clements, seeing their old ship preserved was a deeply emotional experience, a validation of their service and sacrifices, and a means of ensuring that future generations would understand what they had endured. The journey of the KIDD from Philadelphia to Baton Rouge was itself a remarkable feat of engineering and determination. The aging destroyer had to be carefully towed more than 2,000 miles, navigating the Atlantic coast, rounding Florida, and entering the Gulf of Mexico before finally making her way up the Mississippi River to her new home. At each stage of the journey, precautions were taken to protect the historic vessel from damage, ensuring that she would arrive in a condition suitable for restoration as a museum ship. The USS KIDD Veterans Museum opened to the public on August 27, 1983. In the years that followed, the ship underwent careful restoration to return her to her August 1945 configuration. This painstaking process involved sourcing period-appropriate equipment from around the world, including twin 20mm gun mounts, depth-charge projectors, and other hard-to-find items. The restoration culminated on July 3, 1997, when her torpedo tubes were ceremonially reloaded, completing her transformation into a living time capsule of naval warfare. The restoration efforts were guided by veterans like Monning and Clements, whose first-hand knowledge of the ship proved invaluable in ensuring historical accuracy. They worked alongside maritime historians, naval architects, and dedicated volunteers, many of whom had family connections to World War II service. This collaboration between those who had lived the history and those committed to preserving it ensured that the KIDD would represent not just a physical artifact, but the human experiences associated with her service. Today, the USS KIDD remains the only destroyer in the United States to be preserved in her World War II configuration. Her distinctive pirate emblem still adorns her stack, and the Jolly Roger occasionally flies from her mast on special occasions, a continuation of the tradition that began during her first voyage across New York Harbor. Visitors can walk her decks, explore her compartments, and gain a visceral understanding of what life was like for the sailors who served aboard her during some of history's most pivotal moments. But the museum experience offers more than just a glimpse into naval architecture and technology. Through photographs, personal effects, and recorded interviews with former crew members, it tells the human story behind the legend of the ghost ship, the story of men like Harold Monning and Maurice Clements, whose courage, innovation, and determination allowed their vessel to survive when others were lost. It preserves the memory of those 38 sailors who died on April 11, 1945, ensuring that their sacrifice is not forgotten. The KIDD's unique mooring system, which allows her to rest on blocks when the Mississippi River is low and float when the water rises, mirrors her wartime resilience, adapting to changing conditions while maintaining her essential character. This engineering solution, partly designed by former crew member Morris Clements, ensures that visitors can access the ship year-round, regardless of the river's fluctuations. It also protects the historic vessel from the damage that could result from constant exposure to water or the stresses of being permanently secured in a single position. In 2024, the ship faced a new challenge when she embarked on her first major preservation project since arriving in Baton Rouge. Towed to a shipyard in Houma, Louisiana, the KIDD underwent extensive hull repairs and restoration work to ensure her long-term survival as a museum. This project, undertaken by maritime construction firm Thomas, represented a significant investment in preserving the ship for future generations, a recognition of her importance, not just as a war memorial, but as a tangible connection to the past. The tale of the USS KIDD transcends military history. It speaks to universal themes of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, of innovation born from necessity, and of ordinary individuals rising to extraordinary challenges. The Japanese pilots who feared her as a supernatural presence were responding to something very real: the indomitable human spirit that refused to surrender, even when conventional wisdom suggested all was lost. Each year, on April 11th, a ceremony is held on the fantail of the KIDD, beginning precisely at 1:55 in the afternoon, the exact moment the kamikaze struck in 1945. Veterans, family members, and the public gather to remember those who were lost and to honor those who survived. As the years pass and fewer World War II veterans remain to share their firsthand experiences, these ceremonies take on added significance, forming a bridge between past and present. In 2025, the 80th anniversary commemoration included a new exhibit featuring a life-size recreation of Sub-Lieutenant Shigehisa Yaguchi, the Japanese pilot who died in the kamikaze attack, wearing authentic flight gear. This edition represented an evolution in how we understand and memorialize the complex history of warfare, recognizing the humanity of all participants while still honoring the sacrifices of American servicemen. It acknowledged that the young Japanese pilots, many barely out of their teens, were also victims of a militaristic regime that had weaponized their patriotism and sense of duty. The USS KIDD's journey from combat vessel to museum ship mirrors America's own evolution from a nation at war to one seeking to understand and contextualize its military history. While celebrating the heroism of those who served, the museum also acknowledges the sobering reality of combat and its human cost. In this balanced approach, it offers valuable lessons for contemporary audiences navigating a complex world. The ship has become more than just a static display. It serves as an educational resource for schools throughout Louisiana and beyond. Students who visit the KIDD gain insights not only into naval technology and tactics, but into the human dimensions of conflict, the fears, hopes, and relationships that defined the wartime experience. Through educational programs, overnight encampments, and interactive exhibits, young people develop a connection to history that textbooks alone cannot provide. For the Japanese pilots who encountered her in the Pacific, the KIDD was a mysterious adversary that seemed to defy destruction, a ghost ship that returned again and again despite their best efforts to sink her. For the American sailors who served aboard her, she was something far more tangible, a home, a weapon, and ultimately a lifeline when death seemed certain. And for those who visit her today, she is a silent witness to history, a steel monument to human ingenuity and courage. The legacy of the USS KIDD extends beyond her physical presence in Baton Rouge. Her story has been featured in books, documentaries, and even Hollywood productions. In 2018, she served as a stand-in for the fictional USS Keeling in the film Greyhound, starring Tom Hanks, introducing a new generation to the reality of naval warfare during World War II. Though the film depicted Atlantic convoy duty rather than Pacific combat, The authenticity of filming aboard an actual Fletcher-class destroyer lent credibility to the production and brought renewed attention to the KIDD's preservation. What would you have done in those desperate moments off Okinawa, with your ship burning around you and the sea threatening to claim everything? Would you have followed the rule book, or would you have innovated, adapted, and overcome like the sailors of the USS KIDD? Their story reminds us that official protocols and formal training, while essential, are sometimes superseded by the resourcefulness and courage of individuals confronting the impossible. As the sun sets over the Mississippi River, casting long shadows across the decks of the USS KIDD, the presence of those who served aboard her seems to linger, not as supernatural apparitions, but as echoes of courage and sacrifice that resonate across the decades. The ghost ship earned its nickname not through any paranormal quality, but through the most human of traits, the refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. Share this account of the ghost ship that refused to die, so others may remember what courage really means.